Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics podcast. So, as I said last week, Michelle is still taking a break. She's just taking some time to heal a little bit, like we talk about often, not pushing ourselves, things like that. And this is a recording because as you're watching this, I am on vacation and in Hawaii. So, hopefully, enjoying myself. I'm sure I will be looking forward to a lot of time outdoors. Really looking forward to going out and doing some hikes in that area. I've never been all the way there out west. A lot of my outdoor adventures are here on the East Coast. So I know that's going to be a lot different, and I'm really looking forward to that. So today we're going to be talking about the compliance risk of billing under the wrong provider. And, this is something, again, I feel like a lot of the topics we talk about should be common sense. And for a lot of people listening, it may be something where you're even questioning why we're talking about it. But I'm still seeing that there are a lot of issues around compliance in this area. And it's just very concerning that people continue to do this at the level where we have this happening with every encounter being done by other practitioners in a group. Now, something that has been interesting for me, especially over the past year, I've always done a lot of work on the provider side of the industry, sometimes with the payer side, dipping my toes in there. But over the past year, I've had a lot more involvement, not only on the payer side, but also working with different SIU departments. So within this, it's been really interesting to see how they work from the perspective of things like sampling. What is going to show that a particular provider is an outlier or a potential concern to that investigator, what prompts them to look into this. And it's becoming more and more prevalent in my work there, but also in my work with providers and different practices, especially small practices, where we continue to have either a physician or a certain type of practitioner who is continuing to bill everything being done in their practice under their NPI number instead of the number of the person who's rendering the service. Now, I always have to put this into a couple of different buckets to make sure that I'm fully understanding the situation and what it looks like. And to me, I view the work that's done with behavioral health a little different because we have different practitioners with different levels of licensing, and just in general, clinically, that does look different with those different licenses and state law, scope of practice, things like that. So, first and foremost, if we look at medical specialties that are not behavioral health related, remember that Incident 2 at its base level is a CMS concept. So this is not something that automatically applies to all of the commercial payers just because you think that it does, or you can't find a policy that, says do these things. It doesn't mean that it's a free for all and you get to do it across the board. So, at a base level, what we have to look at is actually credentialing. The reason for that is payer policy, and within the guidelines, the provider manuals, the credentialing manuals, they are going to tell you the type of practitioner and licensing that is recognized by the payer from an enrollment perspective, which then requires you to go through credentialing and enrollment, that whole application process. So if we have, for example, a physician who's hired a physician assistant, that physician does not get to decide for Blue Cross Blue Shield and United Healthcare whether or not they're going to credential and enroll that PA under their practice. No, they have to look to policy to see what the correct directive is. And years ago, I've really lost track at this point because I remember it being during COVID. I know this sounds really funny, but during COVID, I would go out on daily walks and have conversations with some some of my friends that are in the industry and consultants, and we would talk about some of the changes. And for some reason, I have a vivid memory talking to my friend Pam, and we were going over the changes with United Healthcare, and I believe at the time it was Blue Cross Blue Shield as well, where they finally said, nope, you have to credential and enroll all practitioners when we're looking at PAs and NPs. So our advanced practitioners have to be credentialed and enrolled. So from that point forward, it's not a choice. You don't get to pick and choose. And on top of that, if it's a situation where the payer does say that they follow incident to, you have to truly look at all sides of that. It's not only a revenue concept, it's not only something that you get to make the decision because you want that additional 15%, which there's arguments about the fact that it doesn't end up totaling at 15%, but it's not a money only decision. There are very specific guidelines and steps as to how to do that compliantly. So as a quick breakdown, remember when we talk about anything that is incident to, which does come into play when you choose to bill one practitioner under another, we have to look at a patient having an established treatment plan with we'll call them a supervisor for now. So it could be a physician. We'll talk a little differently here about behavioral health in a minute. But if that physician wants to bill for APP services, they have to see that patient independently on their own on that first date of service and create a treatment plan if they want to plan to do incident to in the future. Now, remember also, incident to is just a concept in the office setting. This is not applicable in the different facility settings. This is just office based. So, in that situation, when that patient comes back for follow up, also remember that the APP practitioners are only able to continue and follow that initial treatment plan. Now, where some people get this wrong and it really starts to cloud this and makes it very difficult from a defense perspective is if you have a physician who tries to put every scenario under the sun, like with, for example, rheumatology. I work with a lot of rheumatology practices that always want to explore incident to because they feel like they're losing out on reimbursement. But if you don't have proper understanding and proper oversight, it's very risky because a lot of patients who are seen by that specialty, number one, they're very complex. Number two, they're often in pain. They have a lot of acute issues that tend to have to be worked up, a lot of exacerbation of existing conditions. So those types of things can very easily fall outside of incident to. So when a new rheumatology patient is seen in a practice, it does not mean that a physician can list 10 things that could potentially happen with this patient and what they want the APP practitioner to do in all of those 10 situations if they do occur. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, why is that your stance? We could always argue that that is the physician's treatment plan. But remember, when we're talking about things like this on the episode, I hope you're listening to this from the perspective of prevention, meaning that you don't need someone to defend you in this area. And when we're looking at prevention, remember E&M services are based on how the patient is on that day. We're not looking at what the ifs, ands, or buts or could be's in the future. We're looking at here and now at a present time. So if we can't use the potential outcomes towards coding now, why is that going to count towards coding concepts and guidelines in the future? So yes, different people have different viewpoints on that, but that's why I look at it that way. To me, it's all about risk mitigation and how you're setting up workflow in your practice to be successful or have to spend a lot of money to defend yourself, which hopefully would never be your goal, right? So I say all of this because, again, CMS-based concept. So the last part of this is that when the patients do come in and they have an issue, so they have a new complaint or an exacerbation, it requires new workup, new treatment plan to be initiated. that physician or another physician in the group who wants to bill for the APP's work then has to go in and take over that entire encounter and see that patient independently and document their own work. So this does not mean that the APP could write up a plan based on what they think should happen clinically. Then they go have a discussion with their physician, who then agrees and tells them go ahead and implement that. And they say, I talked to Dr. Smith and they agree with the changes in the treatment plan. That does not support incident two, because think about this. When you have an APP practitioner at the state level, when we look at scope of practice, things that are more on the legal side, there's requirements there in different states related to the supervision and collaboration between a physician and an APP practitioner. So just because you collaborate with someone and it's a part of legal supervision does not mean that you automatically qualify for incident two. Now, the last area, and this is something that a lot of people don't even realize is built into the concept of incident two, and that's the fact that the physician has to continue to remain involved in the care of the patient to show that they are actively participating in that. Now, we don't have a lot of strict perimeters around this, meaning, CMS and payers aren't giving us specific timelines that this has to be done within. I personally like to see that a physician has seen the patient at least once every year, and kind of use that as a gauge to say, okay, do they have a good workflow in place where they're paying attention to how often a patient is seen by a physician? Could we argue, could we defend so that they continue to remain involved in the care of the patient? Remember, those encounters need to again be independent. It's not just talking with them about a change in a dose and the APP documenting a discussion and saying, yeah, they're involved. No, they're stating that you are physically present and involved at a frequency that shows that you continue to be a part of their treatment plan. So, super gray, wide, open ended. I'm sure that different attorneys, for example, have different thoughts on that as well. That's just where I have a comfort level with the work that I've done from the preventative side and the defense side. It's the way that I personally gauge that. Now, with that being said, a lot of times we will see encounters where not only is an APP practitioner treating the patient for an acute problem, but if we look back in an EMR system, we can see, okay, that patient's not been seen by a physician for years. I've had situations where it's been 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and they've seen a PA the entire time, and they've not been seen by the physician. How are we going to argue that? That's like pretty much nothing there to argue against, right? So we've got to be careful, make sure workflow is set. Now, again, remember on the commercial side, it's not an automatic. It doesn't mean that they're automatically going to allow incident two. And if they do credential and enroll the provider type and that licensing type, you have to go through that step. So incident two is not a way to get claims paid while you're waiting for credentialing. If you're doing that, chances are you're not doing it correctly. It's one of those things where, for me personally, in my audit work, I have to say that almost the majority of the time when I audit incident two, and I'm putting it under the bucket of incident two because you are billing it under the wrong practitioner, under someone else's NPI number in the office, which is incident two. Most of the time when I do these audits, I do not see compliance. I see people doing it just for reimbursement purposes, to the point that some will say they don't even want to hear feedback on incident two because they are not willing to change anything due to the fact that it would lessen reimbursement. That is a massive issue, and that should be a red flag if you're working in compliance and anything to do with the revenue cycle in a group. We should never have a physician billing across the board for everybody. And remember too, when they are billing and using their NPI number, they have to be there as well. They've got to be in the practice. So they can't be going between 3 different practices, which I've had happen, where a physician has their own schedule and there's APPs in 3 different practice locations, and all day long his schedule and their 3 schedules are all billed under his NPI number. That is a very clear red flag because you have a massive volume, you have a massive amount of revenue, and that's going to be very clear. And that leads into what I've been seeing on the behavioral health side, especially when it comes to my work on the payer side of the industry, where they pretty much have told on themselves in some of these practices, because we have situations where not only is one practitioner billing for everybody in one group, but they're also associated with multiple different groups and doing the same thing between different locations, but not showing that in the claims data. So that can still be tracked, and it's still going to be tied to the NPI number where you stand out as an outlier. You're going to trigger that probe review. And then at that point, we can start looking, okay, why do some of these notes come from one particular counseling center and another set of notes come from a different behavioral health practice? And why, when we look this person up online, which remember, all of that's public information. So even if I'm auditing and questioning things, even though I'm not the investigator, I will go in and do that type of research myself, whether it's for prevention or working for a payer, just to understand what is happening. And sometimes when we see different practice locations showing up in the headers of the note, and then we Google and we see that that practitioner also owns their own group, that's going to be really shady. It's going to be very questionable as to what's happening. And we've seen an increase in this over the years in behavioral health because we've had a lot of organizations that are transitioning over to telehealth, or at least have a large offering of telehealth services, even when they have physical locations. So sometimes what people have done is they've signed on and said, oh, well, I will be a supervisor, meaning that you can bill the payer under my NPI number, and I will be the one of record that's supervising this person. But when we dig back in, whether that practitioner is seeing patients just out of one location and supervising out of one location, or if it's all these different places like I've seen, the question is still going to become, what was the involvement? And when you look at commercial payers, you will find that if they have policies, for example, like Incident 2, or if you go into their credentialing information and they say, for example, there are different types of counselors that type of licensing is not going to be something where they can obtain enrollment and credentialing. Or if we're in this situation, like Blue Cross Blue Shield plans will often allow for a graduate of a program to render services that a supervisor could bill for while they're waiting to get their clinical hours to get their state licensing. So different psychologists, social workers, different licenses like that. They have a policy where they will allow that, but if you look at the policy, it says that it's still applicable to Incident 2, which means that the provider, let's say a psychologist, or if you have any if you're familiar at all with ABA therapy for autistic children, this can happen with the supervisors versus the technicians because the technicians are not credentialed and enrolled. So when you have this mix where you do have situations where the employee type per policy is allowed to render care, but they cannot be credentialed and enrolled, that does create a situation where the supervisor is allowed to bill for them, but people just stop. They don't look any further. They say, okay, I can go ahead and bill for all of these. It's all going to go under my NPI number. It doesn't matter. Very straightforward. Well, that's where they're missing that reference to Incident 2. because when I've been involved in these reviews, especially on the payer side, what we're seeing is that yes, incident 2 is applicable, but that practitioner, say that psychologist or that BCBA supervising, has never even seen some of the patients that they've been billing out for multiple days, multiple sessions, over a year. They're always there. It's always their NPI, but every single note is showing that someone else not only was rendering the service, but someone else was involved with the treatment plan, with the actual supervision, things like that. So it's not enough to just call yourself a supervisor and then put that, put your NPI number on everything. I have also seen that at times there's a footer that's embedded into the final progress notes within an EMR system where it says that so and so is supervising this practitioner per whatever state. Again, that still is not going to be enough if we can't find the other information that traces you back to actively being involved in meaningful care of that patient. And I've started to use that word more. I know that that's something Michelle likes to say a lot as well. And when you think about it, that makes sense because it's not just checking a box, it's meaningful care, meaningful oversight. What is your personal involvement? And lastly, one thing that I want to say here is that you have to remember that payers are now also looking back on claims data when they are maybe auditing just a small subset of claims. So, what I mean by that is maybe a payer is only auditing you for almost the first 4 months of 2026. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to run everything, meaning your entire universe of claims for, maybe the practice opened or you started in 2023. There's nothing stopping them from running that data and taking a look at it and saying, why from 2023 do we have this particular volume? Or why did the volume pick up drastically in 2024? All of these types of things are going to be a part of the way that they're looking at your utilization data. And this all goes into that fear that people have that they're going to be audited, right? And I'm of the mindset that that just doesn't matter. It shouldn't be a fear because there's no way to get around it, especially the way they're able to zero in just on one practitioner or one CPT code, one diagnosis. You cannot get out of the radar of a payer and think that you're not going to fall to an audit. It can happen to anybody. It's going to happen if it's not happened to you already. So if you're doing something that's risky, you're making your decision on revenue, you're not paying attention to what all of the payers say, and you think that CMS applies across the board, then you've really got to pause. You need to do an external audit. This is another reason why it's not a good idea to continue to only do internal reviews. If this is something where your billing team, your coding team has been given directives, or the front desk of a practice that does the charge entry has been given directives to always bill under Dr. So-and-so, or always bill these particular therapy services under that one psychiatrist or that one psychologist, that is where you are going to have issues because that really does not exist in that particular way in any policy for any payer. So you have to understand what's in place. You have to look at credentialing. If you have situations where you're bringing new practitioners in, you've got to look to change your workflow on credentialing and enrollment. Just because you waited until the very day that they started to start that process does not give you the right to remain compliant and bill that under another practitioner. All of these rules still apply, and to think that you could potentially get away with it and not have that NPI number of the person billing show up with higher volumes, higher dollar amounts, that's where people are really being led in the wrong direction by not taking the time to truly understand what it is that is going on. So at the end of the day, It's a huge compliance problem if you have any services, if you're a physician, a practitioner, if there is stuff being billed out under your NPI number across the board or the majority of the time, then you need to understand that process. If you don't own that practice, if you're not in administration of that practice or that organization, you need to be going to the revenue team and finding out why that is occurring, because again, that's going to be you and your number and your claims ultimately that are going to be questioned. If you are in a position where you're being told to bill this way, you need to pause and stop and start to look into that. If it's something where you know that they are fully out of compliance, it would be my suggestion that you let them know, like, hey, I've processed everything I can. All of these other things are sitting here. I'm not touching them. It doesn't support billing under the physician. And then you should probably look to get out of there, because clearly they're not going to listen if they just do it across the board because they want the revenue. So make sure you're paying attention. Make sure you truly understand what message is being sent by an NPI number on the claim, and make sure that you are remaining compliant. So we'll go ahead and end there for today, and I will be back next week in person, not just this recording, and hopefully well refreshed after my vacation. So I hope you all have a good rest of your week and weekend, and we'll see you back next week with Michelle.